Blood and oaths bind a pack, but words shatter them faster than silver. My wedding dress was spun from heavy northern wool, meant to survive a harsh winter. Not a colder husband. "Don't touch me," Gideon snarled, the heavy oak door shuddering under his fist. He didn't have to say it twice. While he drowned his resentments in ale downstairs, I didn't weep. I packed a rucksack, stole his thickest hunting cloak, and vanished into the timberline before sunrise. Frost crawled up the leaded glass of the bedchamber window, fracturing the moonlight into jagged slivers across the floorboards. I sat perfectly still on the edge of the mattress. My spine throbbed from the weight of the ceremonial iron beads woven into my braids, and the stiff linen of my bridal shift scratched mercilessly against my collarbones. It wasn't a garment meant for a lover's touch. It was a treaty wrapped in fabric, a political bandage slapped over a bleeding border dispute between our packs. Smoke from the dying hearth fire clung to the tapestries, smelling bitter, like wet ash and stale pine. Downstairs, the great hall still vibrated with the thumping boots and drunken howling of Gideon's pack, celebrating our union. My pack, what was left of them, was miles away, nursing their pride and the peace I had bought them. I traced the grain of the wooden bedpost with a thumb, feeling the rough splinters. I didn't expect romance. I wasn't an idiot. I knew Gideon resented this arrangement as much as I did. He was the alpha king of the crags, a man who smelled perpetually of copper blood and frost, accustomed to taking what he wanted, not having a lowland bride shoved down his throat by a council of elders. But I had prepared myself for the ugly, mechanical reality of a royal mating. Endure it. Secure the bond. Survive. Footsteps echoed in the stone corridor outside. Heavy. Deliberate. Not a man eager for his wedding bed, but a warlord marching to a skirmish. The iron latch clacked sharply. The door swung open, dragging across the uneven stones with a grating screech that set my teeth on edge. Gideon stood in the threshold. He looked massive in the dim light, his broad shoulders filling the frame. He hadn't bothered to remove his formal furs, and they carried the sharp, damp scent of the winter night, mixed with spilled mead and the heavy musk of an agitated predator. His jaw was clenched so tight I could see the muscle ticking beneath his beard. He didn't look at my face. His eyes, a pale, washed-out amber, remained fixed on the stone wall just above my head. I stood up. The floorboards were like ice against my bare feet. I took a single hesitant step forward, raising a hand. It was instinct, an offering of truce. "Gideon," I started, my voice tight and thin in the drafty room. He flinched, not a subtle tightening of muscles, but a visceral, full-body recoil, as if I had lunged at him with a branding iron. "Don't touch me." The words didn't boom. They weren't a roar. They were a low, guttural snarl that vibrated in my sternum. It was the tone a wolf uses right before it tears out a throat. Disgust. Absolute visceral repulsion. I froze. My hand dropped to my side, slapping lightly against my thigh. He finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes wasn't just anger. It was suffocation. I was a cage built of vows and expectations, and he was violently rejecting the bars. He took a sharp breath, his nostrils flaring, and stepped backward, retreating into the hallway. "I won't do this," he muttered, the words jagged and rushed. "Sleep where you want. Just keep out of my sight." The door slammed shut. The draft from the impact extinguished the last candle on the nightstand, plunging the room into aggressive darkness. I stood there in the dark for a long time. The only sound was the hollow, rushing noise of blood in my own ears. I waited for the tears. I waited for the crushing humiliation, the wailing despair of a rejected mate that the old ballads always sang about. It didn't come. Instead, a strange, creeping numbness washed over me, followed immediately by a sharp, acidic clarity. I walked to the hearth and grabbed the heavy iron poker, stirring the embers until a faint, orange glow illuminated the space. I looked at the massive, empty bed. I looked at the door. He told me to keep out of his sight. Fine. I stripped off the scratchy bridal shift, leaving it in a crumpled white heap on the floor like a shed skin. The cold air bit into my naked skin, raising goosebumps. But I moved quickly. I pulled on my thickest wool trousers, the ones I used for hunting, smelling faintly of saddle leather and horse sweat. I layered 2 woolen tunics and laced up my knee-high riding boots. I found a leather rucksack in the corner of his wardrobe. I didn't care that it bore his crest. I stuffed it with pragmatic aggression, 2 pairs of thick wool socks, a flint and steel, a heavy skin of water, and a block of hard cheese from the welcome basket they had left on the table. My fingers brushed against a staghorn-handled hunting knife resting on his dresser. The blade was freshly oiled. I slid it into my boot. Finally, I grabbed his thickest winter cloak from a peg by the door. It was heavy, lined with dark fur, and smelled overwhelmingly of him. Pine needles, wood smoke, and that sharp, aggressive musk. I wrapped it around my shoulders, letting the heavy folds drag on the floor. I didn't leave a note. Notes were for people who expected to be followed. Gideon had made his position brutally clear. I was a problem he refused to solve. So I was removing the problem entirely. I strapped the rucksack to my chest, eased the heavy iron latch open, and slipped out into the freezing stone corridor. Wind battered the mortar of the keep, howling like a wounded animal as I navigated the spiral staircase. The stone steps were worn smooth in the center, treacherous and slick. I kept one hand on the freezing wall, feeling the grit of the masonry scrape against my palm. I was hyper-aware of every sound. The rustle of Gideon's heavy cloak against my boots sounded deafening. My own heartbeat pounded a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The great hall was still loud, but the noise was thick and sloppy now, the sound of men too deep in their cups to notice a shadow slipping out the servants' door. I bypassed the main kitchens, ducking into the narrow corridor that led to the root cellars. It smelled of damp earth, rotting potatoes, and aging root vegetables. The air was stale, heavy on the lungs. I shoved my shoulder against the heavy oak postern door. It protested with a low groan, the hinges stiff with frost. I slipped through the narrow gap and into the courtyard. The cold hit me like a physical blow. It was a dry, biting wind that immediately sucked the moisture from my eyes and nostrils. Snow crunched beneath my leather boots, a sharp, rhythmic snapping in the dead silence of the outer ward. I kept my breathing shallow. A cloud of white vapor plumed from my lips with every exhale, tasting of copper and raw winter. 2 guards were stationed by the outer iron gate. They were huddled together around a sputtering brazier, their cloaks pulled tight over their heads, complaining loudly about the draft. I didn't try to sneak past them. I was wearing the Alpha's personal cloak, bearing his crest. I walked with my head down, my steps purposeful and heavy. "Night, my lady," one of them mumbled, barely glancing up from the fire, assuming I was some favored servant fetching wood or simply getting sick in the snow. I didn't answer. I just kept walking, slipping through the heavy iron grate that had been left slightly ajar for stragglers. And then I was out. The transition was immediate and violent. Inside the walls there was the illusion of safety. Outside there was only the vast, indifferent darkness of the Iron Peak territory. The tree line loomed 50 yards ahead, a solid wall of black pine against the bruised purple sky. I marched toward it. My legs felt heavy, but adrenaline pumped battery acid through my veins, forcing me forward. Once I hit the trees, the wind died down, blocked by the dense canopy, but the temperature seemed to drop further. The smell of pine resin and decaying needles was overwhelming. It was an hour later when I hit the boundary markers. They were ancient stones, covered in frost, reeking of the pack's territorial scent, a mix of wolf urine, blood, and aggression. To a human, it was nothing. To me, it was a physical wall of pressure pushing against my senses. Crossing it meant severing the tether. A wolf without a pack wasn't free. A wolf without a pack was a target. A rogue. I paused by the largest stone. My chest heaved. The sheer, terrifying weight of what I was doing finally crashed into me. I had no money. I had no allies. The political treaty my father had bled for was currently null and void, resting on my shoulders. I was walking into the dead of winter with nothing but stolen cheese and a hunting knife. I squeezed my eyes shut, a brief, jagged spike of panic piercing through the numbness. I could turn back. I could sneak back into that freezing room, curl up on the floor, and pretend none of this happened. I could endure the disgust in Gideon's eyes every morning. I could survive the hollow, loveless existence of an unwanted queen. "Don't touch me," the memory of his snarl echoed in the dark woods. The visceral repulsion, the way he had looked at me like I was a rotting carcass dragging itself across his clean floor. My eyes snapped open. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, hard knot of pride in my gut. I would rather freeze to death on a mountain pass than live as an infection in another man's house. I stepped past the boundary stone. There was no magical snap, no sudden thunderclap, just the crunch of snow beneath my boot. But internally, the faint, comforting hum of the pack bond, a hum I had felt in the back of my mind since birth, went dead silent. It was like suddenly going deaf. The isolation was absolute. I pulled Gideon's cloak tighter around my neck, burying my nose in the fur. It still smelled like him. It made my stomach twist, a cocktail of nausea and irrational comfort. But it was thick and it was warm. I kept walking. The terrain grew steeper, the snow deeper. My thighs burned with effort, and my toes were beginning to lose sensation. Survival quickly eclipsed anger. I couldn't walk all night. The cold would kill me before dawn. I found a massive, uprooted spruce tree roughly 2 miles past the border. The root system had pulled up a wall of frozen earth, creating a small, sheltered hollow underneath the trunk. It smelled heavily of damp dirt and fox musk, but it blocked the wind. I crawled into the narrow space, my knees scraping against frozen rocks. I brushed away the snow as best I could. Making a small nest of dry pine needles, I scrounged from the surrounding area. I curled into a tight ball, pulling my knees to my chest, and wrapped the heavy fur cloak completely around myself, creating a cocoon of trapped body heat. The darkness under the roots was absolute. I lay there, listening to the wind screaming through the treetops high above. My muscles twitched with exhaustion. I was cold, I was alone, and I was officially a hunted rogue. I closed my eyes, shoved my freezing hands under my armpits, and waited for the morning. Dawn broke like a bruised eye, bleeding a sickly, pale violet light through the canopy of the pines. I didn't wake up so much as I slowly became aware of my own agony. My joints felt packed with crushed glass. Every subtle movement of my shoulders sent a jagged spike of pain down my spine, a harsh reminder of the frozen earth I had used as a mattress. My breath plumed in front of my face, thick and white, leaving a layer of frost on the fur collar of Gideon's cloak. I lay there for a long time, staring at the tangled roots inches from my nose. The smell of damp dirt and rotting wood was suffocating. I didn't want to move. A lethargic, seductive voice in the back of my mind whispered that it would be so much easier to just close my eyes again. Let the cold do its work. Let the numbness take over completely. It was a cowardly thought, and it made my stomach churn with self-disgust. I forced myself up. My knees popped loudly in the heavy silence. Crawling out from under the root system, I stood and brushed the clinging snow from my trousers. My hands were stiff. the fingers pale and clumsy. I reached for the leather rucksack, fumbling with the frozen buckles. The water skin was solid ice. The block of hard cheese felt like a brick. I managed to break off a small, crumbly chunk and shoved it into my mouth. It tasted like wax and salt, sticking to the roof of my dry mouth. I scooped up a handful of snow, letting it melt on my tongue to wash the heavy mass down. The cold water hit my empty stomach like a stone, making me gag slightly. Survival wasn't romantic. It was ugly, and it hurt. I needed to keep moving. I was too close to the Iron Peak border. Gideon wouldn't pursue me out of a suddenly discovered affection, but he was an alpha. His pride was a volatile, dangerous thing. A bride running away on the wedding night was a public humiliation he couldn't afford. The elders would demand answers. His pack would whisper. To maintain order, he had to bring me back, even if it was just to lock me in a tower and claim I had gone mad. A sound cut through the stillness. It was faint, muffled by the miles of dense timber, but my ears twitched beneath the heavy wool of my hood. A low, resonant vibration that travelled through the frozen ground before it hit the air. A horn. Not a hunting horn, a tracker's call. Panic, sharp and metallic, flooded my mouth. I dropped the remaining cheese into the snow. They were already looking for me. I had assumed it would take them until mid-morning to realize I wasn't just sulking in another wing of the keep. I had underestimated the efficiency of his guards. I strapped the rucksack tight against my chest and began to run. I didn't have the grace of a seasoned scout. I was a diplomat's daughter, trained in pack politics and border treaties, not evasion tactics. I tripped over hidden roots, my boots sinking unpredictably into deep drifts. The heavy cloak, my only source of warmth, snagged on briars, snapping branches with loud, echoing cracks that made me wince. Sweat broke out across my ribs, freezing almost instantly against my linen shift beneath the heavy wool. The horn sounded again. Closer this time. They had wolves in their tracking party. I could smell them on the wind, a heavy, musky scent of wet fur and adrenaline. My own scent trail was a glaring neon sign painted across the pristine snow. I needed water. Running water to wash away the pheromones and the smell of fear pouring off my skin. I angled my descent toward the lowest point of the valley, listening for the rush of a current. 10 minutes later, my lungs burning and my thighs screaming, I found it. A narrow, fast-moving creek cut through the gorge, the water black and violently churning between jagged shelves of ice. I didn't hesitate. I slid down the snowy embankment and stepped into the water. The cold was an immediate, blinding shock. It felt like my legs had been submerged in boiling oil. The water rushed just below my knees, instantly soaking through my leather boots and thick wool socks. I gasped, biting down hard on my lower lip to keep from crying out. The rocks beneath my feet were slick with algae. I slipped, my arms flailing, and plunged my hands into the freezing water to catch my balance. My fingers went numb instantly. I scrambled upright, my breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches. Keep moving. I waded downstream, fighting the current. Every step was pure agony. My feet were blocks of wood, entirely devoid of sensation. I forced myself to walk in the center of the creek for 2 agonizing miles, the icy water leaching the core heat directly from my bones. I knew the signs of hypothermia. I knew I was dancing on the edge of a very steep cliff. When I couldn't take another step, I dragged myself out onto a rocky shoal on the opposite bank. I collapsed onto my hands and knees, shivering so violently my teeth clicked together like castanets. I looked back up the ridge. The wind shifted, and I caught the distinct scent of 2 wolves pacing the edge of the creek where I had entered. They were confused. The trail had vanished. I pressed my face against the frozen pebbles of the bank, closing my eyes. I had bought myself time. but as the agonizing cold crept up my shins and into my thighs, I realized I might have just traded capture for a slow, freezing death. I had to find shelter, a fire and civilization. I had to find the outlands. Shadows stretched long and thin across the snow by the time the trees finally began to thin. I was stumbling more than walking, my boots squelched with half-frozen water, each step feeling like I was dragging iron weights attached to my ankles. The shivering had stopped an hour ago, which I knew was a terrible sign. My mind felt thick, sluggish, wrapped in a suffocating layer of cotton. Then, the smell hit me. Wood smoke. Not the clean, sharp scent of a pine forest fire, but the greasy, heavy smoke of wet timber, roasting fat, and unwashed bodies. I forced my chin up. A mile down the slope, huddled in a muddy depression where the snow had melted into brown slush, sat a settlement. It wasn't a pack village. There were no organized perimeter patrols, no ancestral totems carved into the gates. It was a sprawl of rough-hewn log cabins, canvas tents, and mud-wattle shacks leaning haphazardly against one another. It was a neutral zone, a logging camp where rogues, banished wolves, and desperate humans rubbed shoulders in the filth. It was dangerous. It was unpredictable. It was exactly what I needed. I adjusted the heavy collar of Gideon's cloak to hide the lower half of my face. The garment was too fine, too thick, and screamed of high-born wealth. It made me a target, but taking it off meant freezing to death before I reached the first building. I limped into the settlement as the sun dipped completely below the horizon, plunging the muddy streets into deep twilight. The noise was overwhelming after the dead silence of the forest. The ringing of a blacksmith's hammer, the aggressive braying of mules, and the rough, guttural shouts of men arguing over dice spilled from open doorways. The mud in the main thoroughfare was ankle-deep, sucking at my ruined boots with loud, obscene noises. No one looked at me twice. In a place like this, everyone was running from something. Misery was the common currency, and I was just another bankrupt soul dragging myself through the filth. I found a building that looked slightly sturdier than the rest. A faded wooden sign hung above the door, depicting a crude, stylized tankard. The tavern. It would have a fire. It would have food. I pushed the heavy door open. A wall of heat, smelling of spilled ale, sweat, and burning tallow, hit my face. The room was packed with bodies huddled around low tables. At the far end, a massive stone hearth blazed with a roaring fire. My frozen skin prickled painfully as the warm air touched it. 1,000 tiny needles stabbing my cheeks and hands. I kept my head down and moved toward the bar. The floorboards were sticky beneath my boots. The barkeep was a massive, scarred woman with one milky eye and a jawline that suggested she had a lot of bear blood in her lineage. She didn't smile as I approached. She just wiped a dirty rag across the scarred wood of the counter and stared at me with open suspicion. "Bowl of whatever is hot," I rasped. My voice sounded foreign, cracked and dry like old parchment. "Costs coin," she grunted, her good eye dragging up and down my figure, noting the rich fur of the cloak and the shivering mess beneath it. "You don't look like you carry coin, little stray." I didn't have money. I had left the keep with nothing but the clothes on my back. But I had something else. I reached up with numb, clumsy fingers to the tight braids at my temples. The ceremonial iron beads, the heavy, crude symbols of my marriage to the Alpha King, were still woven tightly into my hair. I dug my nails into my scalp and pulled. The thick hair tore, the sharp edge of the iron scraping against my skin. I didn't wince. I yanked the metal free, pulling a small tuft of bloody hair out with it. I slapped the heavy iron bead onto the sticky counter. It was forged from pure cold iron, intricately etched with the crest of the northern packs. Even here, iron had value. The barkeep looked at the bead, then up at my face. She saw the fresh blood trickling down my temple. She didn't ask questions. She scooped the bead up, bit it testingly, and pocketed it. "Go sit by the fire," she muttered, turning toward a massive iron pot bubbling over the coals. "Don't bleed on the tables." I found a stool tucked into a dark, shadowed corner near the hearth. I collapsed onto it, my muscles giving out completely. I pulled off my wet boots, ignoring the strange looks from the men at the neighboring table, and shoved my freezing, dead-white toes as close to the flames as I dared. The pain of the blood rushing back into my extremities was excruciating, a throbbing, burning agony that made me bite my knuckle to keep quiet. A chipped wooden bowl was slammed onto the table in front of me, sloshing a thick brown stew over the edges. It smelled heavily of salted pork and root vegetables. It was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I ate like a starved animal. I didn't use the wooden spoon. I lifted the bowl to my face and drank the boiling broth, letting it scald my tongue and throat. The heat radiated outward from my stomach, slowly chasing the violent shivers away. As I sat there, staring into the dregs of the stew, the reality of my situation settled over me like a suffocating blanket. I was entirely alone. The pack bond, the psychic tether that had anchored my mind since childhood, was completely silent. In a room full of noise, the quiet inside my own head was deafening. I had traded the gilded cage of a royal marriage for the desperate, dirty survival of a rogue. I traced the rim of the wooden bowl. I was cold, exhausted, and hunted. But as I pulled the heavy folds of Gideon's cloak tighter around my shoulders, I realized something else. My chest expanded, drawing in a deep breath of the stale, smoky air. I didn't belong to my father's politics anymore. I didn't belong to a disgusted alpha king. For the first time in my entire life, I belonged strictly, violently, to myself. Heat brought its own specific brand of torture. As my core temperature slowly climbed back to something resembling human, the numbness in my extremities gave way to a violent, throbbing ache. My toes felt as though they were being held directly over an open flame, the capillaries screaming as blood forced its way back into half-frozen tissue. I shifted on the wooden stool, grinding my teeth together so hard my jaw popped. I couldn't show weakness here. In a room full of outcasts and desperate men, a flinch was an invitation. Smoke from the hearth clung to my damp hair, mingling with the grease of the stew I had just consumed. I kept my chin tucked down, hiding the bloody patch on my temple where I had ripped the iron bead free. Through the fringe of my bangs, I tracked the movement in the tavern. Most of the patrons were deeply drunk, their voices blurring into a dull, aggressive roar. But survival instincts, honed by years of watching political predators at my father's table, prickled at the base of my neck. I was being watched. He was sitting 2 tables away, nursing a wooden flagon of something dark and foul-smelling. He didn't look like a wolf. He lacked the heavy musculature and the aggressive, forward-leaning posture. He was a human scavenger, thin and wiry, wrapped in a patchwork coat of mismatched furs that smelled strongly of wet dog and rancid badger fat. His eyes were pale, watery, and fixed entirely on the heavy, fur-lined collar of Gideon's cloak draped over my shoulders. I carefully slid my right hand beneath the table, letting my fingers brush the cold staghorn handle of the hunting knife tucked into my boot. The man stood up. He didn't walk in a straight line, swaying slightly as he navigated the narrow space between the crowded tables, but his trajectory was deliberate. The tavern noise seemed to dampen around me, honing my focus strictly to the sound of his boots dragging against the sticky floorboards. He stopped right next to my stool, close enough that the sour, yeasty stench of his breath washed over my face. "That's a heavy pelt for a little stray," he slurred, his voice a gravelly rasp. He reached out, his fingernails caked in black grease, and hooked a finger under the hem of the cloak. "Looks like northern wolf work. Too rich for a mud camp. You steal it?" "Let go," I said. My voice was raspy from the cold, lacking the commanding resonance of an alpha, but it was flat and hollow. I didn't move away from him. Shrinking back would only trigger a pursuit response. He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound in his chest. "I think you did. I think a thief shouldn't be wandering around my camp parading stolen goods. Maybe I confiscate it. Turn it into the camp boss for a finder's fee." He tugged harder on the wool, jerking me slightly forward on the stool. I didn't give him a warning. I didn't stand up and declare a challenge. I simply reacted. I ripped the hunting knife from my boot in one fluid upward motion, driving the heavy pommel of the handle straight into the soft cartilage of his knee. He howled, a sudden piercing shriek that cut through the tavern's roar, and buckled sideways. As he dropped, I flipped the blade, catching a fistful of his greasy hair with my left hand, and slammed his face down onto the sticky wood of my table. I pressed the flat of the oiled blade hard against his throat, pinning him there. The tavern went dead silent. The clatter of dice stopped. My heart hammered violently against my ribs, but my hands didn't shake. I leaned in close to his ear, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "If you touch my clothes again, I will open your throat and let you bleed out into this stew bowl. Do we have an understanding?" Beneath my grip, the man whined, a pathetic, high-pitched noise, and gave a frantic, jerky nod. I released his hair and shoved him backward. He scrambled away, clutching his knee and casting terrified glances over his shoulder before disappearing into the shadows near the door. I slowly wiped the blade on my trousers and slid it back into my boot. I looked up. The massive, scarred barkeep was watching me from across the room, her one good eye glittering with a mixture of annoyance and cold calculation. She didn't look impressed. She looked like she was evaluating a difficult piece of livestock. "You're done in here," she grunted, her voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "I don't need blood on my floors tonight. You paid for the stew and the fire. You got both. Out." "I need a place to sleep," I countered, my voice tight. "I gave you solid iron. That buys more than one bowl of slop." She snorted, a harsh, dismissive sound. "Solid iron buys you the privilege of not getting tossed out into the snow naked. You want a bed? Find a ditch. You want a roof? There's an empty stall in the mule barn out back. It stinks of shit, but the animals keep it warm. Go." It was a dismissal. The tavern patrons were already turning back to their drinks, the momentary entertainment over. I had asserted boundaries, but I hadn't bought respect. I grabbed my rucksack, the stiff leather freezing my thawing fingers all over again, and pulled the cloak tight. I walked out the back door into the biting night air. The barn was exactly as she described. It was a drafty wooden structure clinging to the side of the hill, reeking of ammonia, wet straw, and rotting hay. 3 large, ill-tempered mules stamped their hooves in the darkness, snorting aggressively at the scent of a wolf entering their space. I found the empty stall in the back corner. The ground was slick with old manure, but the thick layer of dirty straw provided a barrier against the frozen earth. I didn't care about the smell. I didn't care about the filth. I crawled into the corner, burying myself deep beneath the hay, wrapping Gideon's cloak completely around my face to block out the biting draughts. I closed my eyes, listening to the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the mules. It wasn't a castle, and it wasn't a wedding bed, but it was a fortress. And for the first time in 3 days, I slept without one eye open. Morning broke not with sunlight, but with the brutal, rhythmic thud of a blacksmith's hammer echoing through the slats of the barn. I woke up with my cheek pressed against a pile of damp straw. My spine screamed in protest as I uncurled my body. The deep ache of exhaustion had settled into my marrow, making my limbs feel like they were cast in lead. The air in the barn was thick, smelling strongly of ammonia and the sour, dusty scent of the mules in the neighboring stalls. I sat up and brushed the debris from my cloak. My boots were completely ruined, the leather warped and stiff from the creek water, pinching my toes with agonizing pressure when I forced them on. I needed new footwear, a map, and a way to wash the heavy scent of the Iron Peak territory off my skin. I slipped out the back of the stall and peered through a crack in the warped siding. The logging camp looked even worse in the grey light of day. The mud was a churned, freezing sludge, deep and treacherous. Men were hauling timber onto heavy carts, their breath pluming in the freezing air, while others stood around smoking thin, bitter-smelling cigars. It was an ugly, industrious misery, but it wasn't the loggers that made my stomach drop into my boots. Standing near the center of the thoroughfare, talking to the one-eyed barkeep, was Caleb. He was Gideon's master of the hunt. He was a massive, scarred brute of a man who wore his loyalty to the Alpha King like a physical brand. Even from 30 yards away, through the slats of a dirty barn, I could smell him. The crisp, metallic scent of northern frost mixed with the heavy musk of a dominant wolf. He was fully armored in dark, boiled leather, a massive broadsword strapped across his back. He didn't look like a man searching for a lost, beloved queen. He looked like an executioner tracking a deserter. I pressed my hand against my mouth to muffle the sound of my own ragged breathing. Caleb pulled a thick roll of parchment from his belt. He unrolled it and slapped it against the heavy wooden post outside the tavern, driving a crude iron nail through the center with the pommel of his dagger. He spoke loudly, his voice carrying the deep, unnatural resonance of a high-ranking wolf. "By order of the Alpha King," Caleb bellowed, the casual chatter of the camp dying instantly. "A bounty of 50 silver marks is offered for the return of stolen property. A heavy winter cloak bearing the Iron Peak crest, and the thief who wears it. She is to be returned alive. If she resists, hobble her. But the Alpha wants her breathing." My blood ran completely cold. Stolen property. Gideon hadn't claimed his bride was missing. He hadn't announced that his queen had fled. He had reduced me to a thief who made off with his winter coat. It was a masterstroke of political cruelty. If he announced his bride had run away, it made him look weak, a king who couldn't even control his own mating bed. But a thief? A common, thieving stray? That was a pest control problem. It delegitimized me entirely. Worse, it opened the hunt to everyone. 50 silver marks was a staggering amount of money in the Outlands. It was enough to buy a man a tavern of his own, or passage across the sea. "You hear that, boys?" Caleb sneered, his gaze sweeping over the filthy crowd of loggers and rogues. 50 marks. She's small, she's fast, and she's out of her element. Bring the cloak and the girl to the northern border garrison, and don't try to cheat the king. We have her scent." He turned on his heel, his heavy boots sucking in the mud, and marched toward the tree line. He wasn't staying to search the camp himself. He didn't need to. He had just turned a settlement of desperate, starving men into a pack of bounty hunters. I backed away from the barn wall, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs. I couldn't stay here. The moment I stepped out of this barn, someone would recognize the rich fur of the cloak. But I couldn't leave without it. The temperature outside was still deadly, and my clothes beneath were damp and thin. I was trapped. A shadow shifted in the corner of the barn. I spun around, my hand flying to my boot to draw the knife. "I wouldn't," a voice drawled from the gloom. A man stepped out from behind a stack of rotting hay bales. It wasn't the greasy scavenger from the tavern. This man was older, his face lined with deep, harsh creases, his hair completely silver. He wore plain, sturdy wool and a leather apron that smelled faintly of metal and burnt oil. He held a pitchfork, but the tines were resting on the ground, leaning casually against it. "You're twitchy," he noted, his eyes dropping to the blade in my hand. Understandable, considering you're wearing 50 marks worth of trouble on your shoulders. Stay back, I warned, adjusting my grip on the knife. The man sighed, scratching his stubbled jaw. Name's Cobb. I own these mules, which means you're sleeping in my property. I saw you hobble into camp last night. Saw you pull that stunt with the knife in the tavern. He tilted his head, his dark eyes analyzing me with unsettling precision. You don't smell like a thief. You don't hold a blade like a killer either. You hold it like someone who was taught self-defense by an expensive tutor. I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, calculating the distance to the barn door behind him. 50 silver is a lot of coin, Cobb continued, his voice perfectly level. Half the camp is going to be tearing this place apart in an hour looking for that cloak. You can't outrun them in those boots. You can't fight them all. And if they catch you, they won't just hobble you like the big wolf said. Men out here are ugly when they're greedy. What do you want? I demanded, my voice harsh. A trade, Cobb said simply. He tossed something into the straw at my feet. I glanced down. It was a heavy, stained canvas coat, lined with cheap, matted sheepskin. It smelled terrible, like sour sweat and machine oil. But it was thick. Take off the Alpha's cloak. Bury it in the manure pile out back, Cobb ordered. Put that on. It makes you look like a mule driver. You stay in this barn, you shovel the shit, you haul the feed, and you keep your head down. I'll tell the boys you're my new apprentice, a mute runaway from the southern farms. Why? I asked, suspicious. You could turn me in and collect the 50 silver. Cobb let out a dry, rattling laugh. Little girl, if I walk up to an Iron Peak garrison with you in tow, they won't hand me 50 marks. They'll slit my throat, take you, and keep the coin. I'm old, but I'm not an idiot. Now, make a choice. Drop the pelt and pick up the shovel, or walk out that door and test your luck. I looked at the heavy, beautiful fur of Gideon's cloak. It was the only thing that still carried the scent of my old life, the only thing of value I possessed. I unclasped it from my neck and let it drop into the filthy straw. Burying the cloak felt like digging a shallow grave for a woman I barely knew. I dragged the heavy, luxurious garment by its collar, the pristine, silver-tipped fur dragging through the wet muck of the barn floor. The manure pile sat against the back wall, a steaming, foul-smelling mound of rotting hay, mule dung, and frozen mud. I grabbed the pitchfork. My hands were still clumsy from the cold, the wooden handle rough and splintered against my soft palms. I drove the tines into the pile, the smell of ammonia and decay immediately intensifying, burning the back of my throat. I kicked a trench into the muck, shoved the cloak inside, and buried it. I piled extra dung on top, stamping it down with my ruined boots until there was no trace of the Iron Peak crest, no hint of the fine silk lining. It was gone. I turned back to Cobb. He was holding out the canvas coat. I took it. The material was stiff, frozen in places, and weighed almost as much as the fur, but with none of the warmth. I slipped my arms into the sleeves. The sheepskin lining felt greasy against my skin, smelling violently of old sweat, machine oil, and stale tobacco. I pulled the collar up, letting the rough canvas scrape against my jaw. It was a disguise woven from absolute squalor. Hair, Cobb grunted, tossing a pair of rusted sheep shears onto a hay bale. Wolves have tails. High-born wolves even more so. Chop it off. Make it ugly. I didn't hesitate. I picked up the shears. They were heavy, the blades dull and pitted with rust. I grabbed the long, tangled mass of my dark hair, pulled it taut, and squeezed the iron handles. The blades chewed through the strands with a sickening crunch. I didn't try to make it even. I hacked at it blindly, dropping jagged clumps of hair into the dirt, until nothing was left but a ragged, uneven crop that barely reached my ears. The cold air immediately bit into my exposed neck. Good enough, Cobb muttered, turning toward the stalls. "Grab the shovel. The big one in the corner. Start at the end stall. Duke kicks, so keep your head down when you're behind him. If anyone comes in, you don't look up, you don't make eye contact, and you don't speak. You're a mute. You open your mouth, you're dead." I grabbed the heavy iron shovel. The handle was cold. I walked into the first stall, the massive grey mule shifting its weight nervously as I entered. The labour was brutal. It wasn't the refined, disciplined exhaustion of combat training. It was mindless, bone-grinding work that targeted muscles I didn't know I had. Within an hour, my shoulders burned with a deep, lactic fire. The skin on my palms, unaccustomed to rough wood and heavy iron, tore open, leaving smeared, bloody handprints on the shovel's shaft. I didn't stop. I scooped the heavy, wet manure, tossed it into the wheelbarrow, and moved to the next stall. I leaned into the rhythm of the pain. It was grounding. It gave my mind something to anchor to besides the terrifying void of the severed pack bond. Midday brought the wolves. The barn doors didn't just open, they were kicked inward with a violent crash that sent the mules into a panicked frenzy. Duke reared up, his heavy hooves slamming into the wooden partitions. I froze, the shovel halfway to the wheelbarrow, my heart slamming against my ribs like a trapped bird. 3 men walked in. They weren't from the logging camp. They wore the heavy boiled leather armor of the Iron Peak garrison, their faces smeared with tracking paint. They smelled like wet dog, ozone, and aggressive authority. "Search the stalls," the lead wolf barked, his amber eyes sweeping the dim interior. Cobb stepped out from the tack room, wiping a greasy rag on his apron. He didn't look intimidated. He looked annoyed. "Watch the noise," he growled, his voice carrying a gravelly authority. "You spook my stock, you're paying for the broken legs." "Looking for a thief, old man," the guard sneered, stepping closer. He sniffed the air, his nostrils flaring violently. "Got a tip someone saw a stray matching the bounty sneaking around back here." "Only stray back here is my new boy," Cobb said, jerking a thumb in my direction. The guard turned his gaze on me. I kept my head down, the brim of a filthy flat cap Cobb had given me, pulled low over my eyes. I focused entirely on the shovel. Scoop, lift, toss. My hands were shaking. I forced my grip tighter, letting the pain in my blistered palms anchor me. The guard took 2 steps toward my stall. The heavy scent of his dominance rolled over me, an instinctual pressure that made the wolf inside me whine, urging me to submit, to bare my throat. I bit down on my tongue until I tasted copper. He stopped right behind me. I could hear his heavy breathing. He inhaled deeply. I waited for the shout of recognition. I waited for the heavy hand to grab the back of my coat. Instead, the guard coughed, a violent hacking sound, and took a step back, waving a hand in front of his face. "Gods, the stench in here is foul," he muttered, his voice thick with disgust. The overpowering ammonia of the mule urine, combined with the rotting manure pile hiding the cloak, completely masked my scent. "It's a barn, not a brothel," Cobb replied dryly. "You want to shovel it yourself? Be my guest." The guard spat into the dirt. "Keep your eyes open, old man. 50 silver. You see a girl in a rich cloak, you send word to the border." They turned and marched out, leaving the barn doors swinging in the cold wind. I dropped the shovel. The iron clattered against the floorboards. My knees buckled, and I sank into the filthy straw, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gasps. I was shaking uncontrollably, a delayed reaction to the massive surge of adrenaline. Cobb walked over, his expression unreadable. He kicked the shovel back toward me. "Don't sit down," he ordered, his voice flat. "The wheelbarrow isn't full yet." I stared at the dirt, wiping a mixture of sweat and grime from my forehead with a bleeding hand. He was right. Survival wasn't a single victory. It was a continuous, grueling condition. I grabbed the wooden handle, pulled myself to my feet, and went back to work. Weeks bled together in a haze of dirty snow, cracked skin, and the suffocating smell of damp wool. The logging camp was a purgatory of routine. Break the ice in the water troughs, feed the mules, shovel the stalls, eat whatever grey slop cob boiled over the iron stove. Repeat. My body changed. The soft curves of my previous life melted into lean, stringy muscle. My hands were permanently stained with axle grease, the palms heavily calloused. The chopped hair on my head grew out in uneven, greasy tufts. I looked exactly like what I was supposed to be, a half-starved, mute outland boy who wasn't worth a second glance. But the camp was changing. Gideon had doubled the bounty. 100 silver marks. It was a fortune that corrupted the very air of the settlement. Paranoia became a tangible, heavy presence in the tavern. Fights broke out over imagined whispers. Strangers from the deep outlands, bounty hunters, disgraced mercenaries, and rogue trackers began filtering into the mud-soaked streets, drawn by the scent of royal coin. I felt their eyes on my back whenever Cobb sent me to the central well for water. I learned to walk with a permanent slump, dragging my left leg slightly, keeping my face hidden beneath the filthy cap. It was a Tuesday afternoon, the sky the colour of a bruised plum, when the illusion cracked. I was at the well, hauling up a heavy, sloshing wooden bucket. The rope was slick with freezing rain, burning a friction line across my palms. I rested the bucket on the stone lip, leaning over to catch my breath. A heavy hand clamped down on the back of my neck. I froze. The grip was iron hard. The scent of cheap tobacco, stale ale, and unwashed leather washed over me. "You're a quiet one, ain't you, boy?" a voice rasped. I didn't turn around. I recognized the voice. Wyatt. He was a human mercenary who spent his days sitting by the tavern window, sharpening a hunting knife and watching at the crowds. I gave a short, jerky nod, keeping my eyes fixed on the dark water. I reached for the handle, attempting to pull away. His grip tightened, jerking me backward. "Not so fast. I've been watching you haul water. You drag that left leg like it's dead meat, but your boots wear down even on both heels." He chuckled, a dry rattle. "You're faking the limp. Why is a mute farm boy faking a limp in a mud camp?" Panic spiked in my chest. I kept my mouth shut, letting my shoulders sag to project submissive fear. Wyatt stepped around me, blocking my path to the barn. He reached out, his thick fingers calloused and smelling of dirt, and jerked my chin up. The brim of my cap was pushed back. He stared into my eyes. I saw the exact moment the calculation shifted. Humans couldn't smell the wolf, but they could see the predator. Despite the dirt and the canvas coat, my eyes were still the pale, luminous amber of a born wolf. "Well now," Wyatt murmured, eyes widening. "Ain't you a pretty little thing underneath all that mud?" He didn't connect me to the cloak. He just saw a disguised woman in a camp full of rough men, which was infinitely more dangerous. His thumb brushed aggressively against my lower lip. The wolf inside me, suppressed and starved for weeks, violently rebelled. I didn't think. I reacted with pure, feral instinct. I opened my mouth and clamped my teeth down hard on the fleshy webbing between his thumb and index finger. My sharp canines pierced straight through the skin. Wyatt screamed, a high, panicked sound, violently yanking his hand back. Blood sprayed across the frozen stones. I didn't wait. I grabbed the heavy water bucket and swung it with both hands, smashing it directly into the side of his knee. The wood splintered with a loud crack. Wyatt bellowed, his leg buckling, and crashed into the mud. I sprinted toward the barn, my heart hammering a deafening rhythm. I ran with the terrifying, fluid speed of a cornered animal. I threw myself through the barn doors, dropping the heavy iron crossbar into place. I leaned against the wood, gasping for air, trembling violently. Cobb was by the stove, hot iron tongs in his hand. He looked at the barred door, then at the blood smudged across my chin. "You're bleeding," he stated simply. "It's not mine," I rasped, my voice harsh after weeks of silence. "Who?" "Wyatt, the mercenary." Cobb rubbed his face with a dirty hand. "He knows you're a girl." He saw my eyes. I bit him. 100 silver makes a man vindictive, Cobb muttered, pacing in the dirt. "He won't let that go. If he doesn't figure out who you really are, he'll bring his friends back to claim you as a prize. If he does figure it out, he'll burn this barn down to smoke you out." The truth hit me like a physical blow. My presence was going to get this pragmatic old man killed. "I have to go," I whispered. "You walk out those doors right now. He'll be waiting." "I won't use the doors," I said, looking up at the high, drafty loft. "I'll go out the roof vent. Wait until dark." Cobb didn't argue. He walked to a heavy wooden chest, unlocked it, and pulled out a tightly wrapped bundle. He tossed it to me. "Dried meat, flint, and a real hunting knife," Cobb grunted. "Not that toy you carry." I looked at him, surprised. "Why?" "Because 100 silver brings out the worst in the outlands, and I hate a crowded camp. Get out of here, Stray, before I sell you myself." I strapped the bundle to my back, grabbed a coil of rope, and began the climb to the loft. The hunt was back on, and the outlands were waiting. Frost slicked the rotting wooden slates of the barn roof, turning the steep incline into a deadly chute. I squeezed my shoulders through the narrow ventilation hatch, the rusted iron hinges biting into my canvas coat. The wind outside was a living thing, immediately tearing the breath from my lungs and driving needles of freezing rain against my exposed face. I didn't look down at the muddy alleyway 30 feet below. I anchored my boots against the warped gutters, secured Cobb's rope to the heavy iron weather vane, and rappelled into the pitch-black night. My boots hit the frozen slush with a wet, heavy thud. I crouched, my chest heaving, the bitter air burning the back of my throat. I unclipped the rope and let it dangle. 10 yards away, the perimeter of the logging camp gave way to the dense, jagged wall of the outland timberline. I bolted. I didn't run with grace. I scrambled, my legs pumping furiously, boots breaking through the crust of the snowpack. The canvas coat weighed me down, but I didn't dare shed it. The cold was absolute, a creeping numbness that immediately began gnawing at the edges of my adrenaline. I pushed deeper into the pines, navigating by the faint, bruised light of a half-moon, fighting through the storm clouds. The smell of rotting needles and wet bark filled my nose, masking the stench of the camp. I thought I had a lead. I thought the mud and the dark had covered my tracks. A heavy branch snapped violently to my left. I spun around, dropping low to the ground, Cobb's hunting knife already drawn. The blade caught a sliver of moonlight. "Told you she was a runner," a raspy voice sneered from the shadows. Wyatt stepped out from behind a massive spruce, holding a thick oak cudgel. He wasn't alone. 2 other mercenaries, large men wrapped in filthy furs, flanked him. They had anticipated the roof. They had simply waited by the tree line, letting me do the hard work of leaving the camp's neutral zone. "You cost me a bucket and a lot of pride back there, boy," Wyatt spat, limping slightly as he closed the distance. "Or should I say, girl? Yeah, we figured that out once we washed the mud off your bite mark." I backed up, my boots finding purchase against an exposed root. I didn't speak. I analyzed the space between them. 3 men, heavily armed. I was exhausted, half-starved and shivering. I couldn't win a sustained fight. I had to make it fast, and I had to make it brutally ugly. The man on the right lunged first, swinging a rusty meat hook attached to a length of chain. I ducked beneath the whistling metal, feeling the rush of air against my chopped hair. I drove my shoulder directly into his sternum, using his own forward momentum against him. As we collided, I brought the heavy pommel of Cobb's knife crashing down onto the bridge of his nose. Cartilage shattered with a sickening crunch. He dropped like a stone, screaming through a mask of blood. Wyatt swung the cudgel. It caught me cleanly in the ribs. The impact was a blinding flash of white agony. The breath exploded from my lungs in a ragged gasp. I stumbled backward, my boots sliding in the slush, and hit the frozen trunk of a pine tree hard. My vision blurred. I tasted copper. "Grab her arms!" Wyatt snarled to the remaining man, raising the cudgel for a crushing blow to my skull. I braced for the hit. It never landed. The air pressure in the clearing dropped so rapidly my ears popped. A sudden, overwhelming scent suffocated the smell of sweat and cheap tobacco, crushed pine, fresh blood, and an aggressively dominant winter musk. A shadow detached itself from the canopy above. It didn't fall. It crashed into the snow with the weight of a falling boulder. A massive, midnight black wolf, easily the size of an outland bear, materialized between me and the mercenaries. Its fur bristled like iron wire, and a low, terrifying vibration rattled the ice on the branches. Wyatt didn't even have time to scream. The wolf lunged, its jaws snapping shut around Wyatt's throat. The sound of tearing meat and snapping vertebrae was loud and wet. The mercenary was dead before his body hit the snow. The third man dropped his weapon, turned, and sprinted into the dark, weeping in terror. The wolf didn't chase him. It simply dropped Wyatt's limp body and slowly turned its massive head toward me. Amber eyes, pale, washed out, and burning with a violent, possessive rage. I knew those eyes. The wolf's bones popped and cracked, an ugly, visceral sound of shifting mass. Within seconds, a man stood naked in the freezing snow, the heat radiating off his skin in thick clouds of steam. Gideon, the Alpha King. He was covered in outland blood, his broad chest heaving, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle ticked dangerously. He stared at me. He didn't see the fine wool of a bride. He saw a filthy, hollow-cheeked runaway in a stolen canvas coat, her hair hacked to the scalp, bleeding into the snow with a knife in her hand. His gaze dragged up my throat, stopping at the jagged, raw scar on my temple, where I had ripped his iron mating bead free. A muscle flickered in his cheek. He took a hesitant step forward, raising a hand. It was the mirror image of our wedding night, but reversed. "Clara," he breathed, the word torn from his throat, sounding incredibly fragile coming from a man covered in gore. I tightened my grip on the hunting knife. My ribs screamed, but I forced myself to stand up straight, leveling the bloody blade directly at his chest. "Don't touch me," I snarled. Clara stood her ground against the Alpha King, who threw her away, armed with nothing but outland grit and a bloody knife. The chase is over, but the war for her freedom has just begun. Will Gideon drag his broken queen back to the Iron Peak, or will Clara carve her own pack out of the ice? Her raw survival has changed everything. If you want to see what happens when the hunted becomes the alpha, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this video. Drop a comment below. How would you handle Gideon? Stay feral.